Hello and welcome to the North Star. I'm your host, David Perel, the founder of North Star Media, and this is the North Star Podcast. This show is a deep dive into the stories, habits, ideas, strategies, and rituals that guide fulfilled people and create enormous success for them. And while the guests are diverse, they share profound similarities. They're guided by purpose, live with intense joy, learn passionately, and see the world with a unique lens. With each episode, we get to jump into their minds, soak up their hard-earned wisdom, and apply it to our lives.
My guest today is Samo Burja, the founder of Bismarck Analysis, a firm that analyzes institutions, governments, and companies for high-net-worth individuals. There's never been an immortal human society, and Samo's on a quest to find out why. Known for his great founder theory, Samo's research focuses on the causes of societal decay and flourishing. In this episode, Samo and I talk about the great founder theory through the lens of Apple, Amazon, and the myths that drive Silicon Valley. Then we move to a discussion of geopolitical strategy, where we talk about China, the Suez Canal, Henry Kissinger, the Panama Canal, and the importance of Eurasia from a geopolitical perspective. Then we jump around between ideas like intellectual dark matter, knowledge transfer, Lee Kuan Yew, and the story of Singapore. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
One of the really interesting things that we spoke about at dinner the other night was how Silicon Valley is a really good way to understand great founder theory. So if you want to dive into that, go for it.
Silicon Valley culture is built up in many layers, where nearly every great company and every great founder that has gone through it has altered what it means to work in the Valley. The entire approach where aesthetics became central to product design, user interface, overall like company feel, company brand, that has to be credited to Jobs, as well as the notion that you can combine many highly specialized technologies in a unique way. Like what he brought together with the iPhone was a completely new way to do touchscreens, new ways to like do batteries, new ways to do all sorts of small components that a modern smartphone takes for granted, but they had not been brought together in that exact shape before. This sort of like technical ambition, this engagement with logistical supply chains, this has been even further developed by a company like Amazon and by a founder like Bezos. And with each individual person, there almost emerges a new archetype. Mm-hmm. There's the notion of, well, someone's something like of a Bill Gates, or that person is something of a Steve Jobs. And at this point, Steve Jobs is almost like someone that's considered like somewhat difficult, but that can get things through and has a vision, perhaps a little bit misunderstood, but ultimately will have good judgment and will be able to bring people along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I discovered you through the great founder theory, which we'll get into in this conversation. But I think that one thing that's really cool with Apple is so many of our listeners have this intuitive understanding of, like, we've lived when Steve Jobs was running Apple in 2007, 2008, when Steve Jobs was announcing the iPhone, his famous keynote speeches. And then now, just a couple of months ago, we saw the Apple new headquarters open up. And a lot of that has memories of Steve Jobs embedded within the design. And it's almost a shadow of Steve Jobs in that headquarters. And I think that, talk about that, because that's pretty interesting in terms of the work that you do.
Well, basically, organizations come to be defined by their founders often long after the death of their founders. And this is as true of a Silicon Valley company as it might be of an entire government agency, or of it might be of something like an organized religion or other kind of nonprofit organization. It seems very intuitive that if you as an individual are trying to build out a project, this project has to adapt to your quirks as an individual. Like, you can't actually take off the shelf a manual how to be a CEO. You have to find it within yourself to both manage other individuals, decide, will this person do what they said they're going to do, develop expertise, assessment abilities, develop a bureaucratic process that is custom fitted to your work style. Mm-hmm. If you fail to do this, if you try to run your organization the way everyone else does, well, at best, you're going to have an organization that is as good as what everyone else does. And for some things, this is fine. If you want to serve pizza on 9th, you can definitely do that and not have a deep dive into both yourself and other people and into how you will organize them. But if you want to build an object like, say, Amazon, no, then you have to dive into yourself and you have to dive into other people. You have to think deeply about questions such as, what are people's incentives? What are their emotional responses? what are the mechanisms of conflict resolution that I personally can wield. If you personally can't do conflict resolution and you delegate it to someone else, well, you better trust that person, and that person better be as committed to your company as you are. Otherwise, you'll end up in a situation where the person that could resolve a conflict is not really motivated, will not step in, will not do their work. And furthermore, as you automate more and more of your own work, one way to think about it is a company is in some ways bureaucratic. Like, let me explain what I mean by a bureaucracy.
Yeah.
A bureaucracy, in the terminology of, say, great founder theory, is a institution that has broken down a complex task into many simple steps.
Okay.
These simple steps and this breakdown can be executed by many individuals. In this way, the white-collar worker, that is, say, an accountant, and a blue-collar worker, say, a factory worker in Detroit, are actually doing something very, very similar. There's an extremely complicated process, say a company or the manufacturing of a car, and they're playing a small, very delineated task. Do they really need to understand the entire process? Well, they don't have to, but the creator of the organization better understand what's happening. And over time, of course, we get templates. The very idea of what an accountant is supposed to do is the result of innumerable innovations through both early 20th century American companies all the way back to 16th century Italian banking. Like, if you went into the 15th century and you say, I want an accountant, it's like, do you know what you're asking? Do you know what that role involves? The role of the accountant had to be invented, right? And the tools they're supposed to use, such as particular standards of bookkeeping or particular shapes, that had to be figured out, and not just figured out abstractly. There wasn't like a tome, a big ponderous book of theory of account keeping. It had to be prototyped. It had to be functionally prototyped and part of a real organization. Only then could other organizations imitate. And that's one of the core features of social technology. I believe founders and great founders is this term for people to truly transform entire societies, introduce and prototype new social technologies. And these new social technologies might be simple things. They might be more complicated things. It might be an entire new code of law. Right? And we all know how deeply law permeates society, like everything from our personal lives, like things like divorce law or like inheritance, to the functioning of organizations. Note, one of the bigger constraints on any organization or company you want to build is the already existing legal environment. So it becomes very clear how, say, a lawgiver, be an ancient one or a modern one. An ancient example might be like Kyrgyz, that set up the laws of Sparta. He's semi-mythical, but if you go today to U.S. Congress, one of the 12 busts you'll see there is one of Lycurgus as a wise lawgiver. Now, does this mean in the modern world we agree with Spartan values? Well, no, but you can certainly appreciate the genius of a society where laws are not getting in the way of people doing things, but perhaps are assisting cooperation. And I think there's a way in which perhaps modern society has shot a little bit too much into that direction of getting in the way of doing things.
Cool. So as we transition into great founder theory, I want to, before you go too far, just sort of rope you back in. I want to hear about Jeff Bezos. I want to hear about Amazon, because one thing, as I look at Bezos, one thing that he's done really well is have little tropes that allow him to communicate to thousands and thousands of people. And the one that comes to mind is "it's always day one." It's a 2-word saying that encapsulates everything that Amazon stands for. Things like always trying to be innovative. Things like we've gone so far, yet we have so far to go. And through really intelligent communication, I think it's an intuitive way that people can understand how one person, one great founder, can build an institution that transcends themselves.
Right. I think these sort of like simple, brief descriptions that travel well are extremely important means of communication. As you noted, all the employees know that. People outside the company know this. But I think we shouldn't underestimate what a feat of not just physical engineering all the products of Amazon are, but also social engineering. We are talking about a feat of coordination where you have something that should be, by all rights, like 12, 13, 14 companies. And they're in fact like deeply, closely coordinated. In this very, very real sense, you have a set interface between all the organizations, that sort of sub-organizations that comprise Amazon.
Right.
Like they have basically very important rules about how you interface with other parts of the organization. These were set up when the thing got started. One of the interesting concepts that's a straightforward innovation by Bezos is the concept of a bar raiser. Have you ever heard of this term?
Yeah. I'm vaguely familiar with it.
Basically, what happens is in a normal organization, if you hire someone to hire on your behalf, there is in fact a disalignment of interest. There's what economists call a principal agent problem. The person just wants to hire as soon as possible. They just want to fill in the quota and have someone that on paper meets your specifications as soon as possible. Anything beyond that is like not really their problem. Like you would want them to hire someone very, very excellent and go beyond, the call of duty, but you're only paying them to do this sort of very narrow, legible thing.
And so then over time, the level of people within an organization falls because
exactly,
of that.
Exactly. The people that are professionally doing hiring have a disaligned incentive where for them, the success of the company, sure, is deeply relevant in some sort of distant way, but their immediate day-to-day job, they can get away with doing basically less work or lower quality work. So the bar raiser is Bezos' antidote to this. He basically proposed that if you are a top, I think it's a 4% employee in any dimension, be it engineering, sales, or even human resources, you are made the offer to have a voluntary, prestigious but non-unpaid position where you go through and you interview the people that are already on the stack to be hired. And you don't have, your one power is to veto the hire. The idea is you are there to raise the bar. You are there to raise quality back up. And that is fascinating.
Yeah.
Note, it's realizing that sometimes you cannot buy quality. Sometimes you have to appeal to someone's professional prestige. They take pride in their work as an engineer, and they are not interested in adding more low-quality engineers.
It's funny that
But you also give them power to do this, so they basically exercise this.
It's funny that you're saying this. So this morning I was with a friend who just joined a startup in Chicago, and he left from a public company that all of us are familiar with, and he was on their sales team. Big sales team, hundreds and hundreds of people around the country. And I said, hey, bud, so can you talk about the difference between sales at this large public company versus your startup? And he said, one thing that is frustrating about being at a big sales organization is that the organizational structure is geared towards the lowest common denominator. So if you're any kind of high achiever, you're just pulled back like a dog on a leash, and you're not able to thrive. And so what happens is at this company, all the high achievers leave because they get frustrated, and you're left with basically this lowest common denominator, which I think is exactly what you're speaking to.
Yes, and this mechanism prevents this drift downwards, essentially, at least in recruiting. Now, retaining people is an interesting question. I think, Amazon gets some bad press, some good press. We all love their products. We all, hear some things about working condition in warehouses. The one thing they know how to do excellently, though, is to take people who are highly, highly skilled in a very narrow domain and offer them an environment that's very well suited to them. They treat their top engineers very well. Now, treat them very well does not necessarily mean pampering. What it does mean is that they get to command a higher paycheck because the environment is ordered so that they don't really have to navigate office politics that much. Basically, you have a very narrow, straightforward reporting structure. This can be awfully dysfunctional and oppressive if the narrow reporting structure does not break tasks down very naturally. But it can work extremely well if you've broken down tasks in line with reality. So you have someone that is, actually a very good search engine engineer. You have one meeting with them a week. All you expect of them is to produce a straightforward, accurate description of their work. And this is something that people can thrive on. And as long as they continue performing, they don't get much meddling from anyone else. Their task is really clear, and they just get to do what they love. So this is what I mean by treating top talent well. Often people become top talent because they love what they do.
We've talked about Silicon Valley, Apple, Amazon, but I think a lot of the ideas around institutions, talent, in Silicon Valley have come from Peter Thiel. And I know that you're really familiar with his work. Can you talk about how Peter Thiel factors into all this in terms of the myths, the institutions, and great founder theory?
Well, I think Peter should be credited for helping to intentionally improve the culture of Silicon Valley. His book 0 to 1 was this like massive missive basically explaining what they were searching for in founders. Like if you think about it, Founders Fund, his company had been searching for innovative companies. He has a very good track record of success, having seeing companies such as Facebook and SpaceX rise up, even after his initial success with PayPal. And in that book, he clearly communicates that, yes, we were betting on teams, but more so we were betting on the individuals that organize the team, or maybe a very small subset of the team, like, the stereotype of the technical co-founder and, sort of the salesperson, that sort of partnership. Before this, it was not quite okay to say what everyone knew. Everyone knew that Apple could never have happened without Steve Jobs. Right. But it seemed pretentious or crazy to say, I believe in this new company because this individual will make it happen. After the book, after 0 to 1, it became acceptable to say that. And that was an important cultural jump because it acknowledged the reality of this sort of vast creativity that some individuals bring to the table. Further, the book provided something like a framework to help people understand office politics and PR. Peter draws heavily on the work of René Girard. This is a French anthropologist, philosopher. He has the model of scapegoating as a basic mechanism in society.
And mimetic theory.
Yes, and mimetic theory. To compress the theory very quickly, it is the theory that, humans are very imitative, monkey see, monkey do. And by default, we won't stand out from the herd. But every now and then, some individual will stand out from the herd in a positive way. While this is happening, while this person is solving problems, everyone loves them. However, when social stress and sort of internal infighting overtakes the crowd, they are as likely to scapegoat the high achiever as they are the leper. They will pick on the outsider, and the outsider can be, it can be a criminal or it can be a king, right? And this cycle of PR is very clearly described with something like the transformation of, say, Bill Gates's PR. If you remember, Bill Gates was quite hated at one point, though arguably as admirable as his charitable contributions have been to the world recently, he probably did the world more good by building the Windows operating system, because guess what? All of those charities, they were using computers with Microsoft software.
And when you're saying that when he was building Windows, he was still disliked, even though you're saying he was doing more good in the world. Yeah, that's wild. Okay.
Yeah, it is wild. And, he was kind of almost hated for being the most successful man in the world in a way. You remember all the jokes, 5 years ago about him being the richest person. Now Bezos has to deal with a lot of the same jokes. So anyway, people that start off from a very technical background, that they're young, that are intelligent, that are driven, might be shocked or not expect these problems down the road after success has happened. So this is why I also feel that the book is a very humane book, because it warns people that, with this great achievement, there might come a backlash, even if you do nothing wrong. And that's sobering. But it also tells you how you can, how you can reinvent yourself and how you can avoid or stop the scapegoating process.
I want to switch gears a bit. You spent 3 years living under communism, and I think you grew up in Slovenia, and I think that experience shaped your worldview, or at least was the seed that began to flower into a lot of the things you do today. Can you talk about some of the stuff, at least at a high level, that you do at Bismarck, and then go into your time in Slovenia living under communism?
Of course. Bismarck is a political risk consulting firm. We analyze government agencies and large companies around the world. We tend to break down what happens with a large bureaucratic entity, but also map out the landscape of relevant strategic players. Okay. This flows quite nicely from the research I had done over the past decade, where organizational theory was, one of the core focuses. The other core focus was evaluation of strategic players. Turns out if you put those two together, you can make very accurate predictions as to what will happen in various contexts. And that's this. I feel almost, I feel I'm quite lucky to have been able to make a company that is just so squarely in my intellectual and research interests and also is viable. Now,
and you're the founder, right?
Yes, I'm the founder. Yeah. For Slovenia and my experience with Slovenia used to be part of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was what's called a non-aligned country in the Cold War context. It was a communist country, but it split with the Soviet Union in the 1950s.
Okay.
So there was an interesting combination of, say, a communist society that does some amount of trade with the West, but it was straightforwardly a single-party state. It had a secret police. It had a gulag system. It's called Goli Otok and so on. A lot of realities of life under communism are people understanding when they are deprived of power and when they have to be very careful about what they can say in a political context.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that people were very much aware who is and is not a member of the Communist Party. They were very much aware of when can you say something that is critical of the Communist Party and when can you not say that. They were very much aware that their work opportunities might be curtailed. They might be overlooked for promotion. They might not be able to rent a vacation spot if they say the wrong things, if they're put on these very non-transparent blacklists.
Wow.
This breeds sort of this kind of atmosphere of very slight political paranoia, which is common to a lot of Eastern European countries. Like we all know about the excesses of, say, the Stasi in East Germany, which at one point had dossiers on 20% of the population.
Wow.
Now, this is before the age of mass surveillance. Not everyone had a smartphone. The secret police had to go and install a bug in your apartment, and they did do that. Right? They did do that if one was a political dissident, if one had come to be known as dissatisfied in any way with the system. So the first thing there was people caught on. After a few decades of this kind of regime, the idealism, and there was idealism behind communism, had vanished. There was merely the reality of a system of control you were possibly born into, you didn't approve, you didn't think worked very well, and you were constantly exposed to the Western system is richer.
Right.
That evidence was undeniable. At first, you could say, well, we are a developing country, we're going to catch up and then surpass the West. But after 40 or 50 years, that story becomes less and less plausible as the growth didn't come. So that experience was interesting. The experience of people who are not idealistic about the system they live in. And this causes some problems, but it also it grants a measure of realism.
Okay.
I've said recently, I had a talk on civilization, that Americans are grappling with the notion that sometimes politicians lie and that sometimes newspapers are unreliable.
You must have felt that being educated in a communist country. What was that like? Did you feel like you were getting a tainted education?
Well, I'm young enough to have been mostly at the very end of this process, but all the adults I spoke to had gone through this experience, where some of them ended up, of course, trusting the system as it was. Others were more cynical. And then there was this remarkable thing in the 1990s when the system changed. And you might think that there would be an exuberance or a desire or an enthusiasm about trying the new thing. And to some extent it was, but for the most part, people were like, well, the old system was flawed and corrupt. Let's go to the new flawed and corrupt system. So this is perhaps very pessimistic, but the idea that you could trust public institutions was not taken for granted. That's a trust that's only very slowly being built up in some Eastern European countries, and in some places it's not being built up at all. Right? Say in Russia, trust probably never goes very high. In, say, something like, a Slovenia or an Estonia, trust probably has gone up over the last 20, 25 years. And I think for Americans, it's very easy to be in a highly functional system and just take it for granted that the newspapers will not be too biased, or the politicians will lie, but they'll only lie in the acceptable embellishment direction.
Right.
But that's not the full reality of possibility. Many outcomes are possible. And in fact, there's very complicated social technology keeping newspapers honest, or keeping politicians a little bit honest.
Yeah, so I got to ask you, you were talking about trust in things like newspapers and the press.
Yes.
But at the same time, you have some really interesting ideas about different ways of judging different institutions. And I would love for you to talk about that, because I think it's really interesting where you're saying in the West we can trust these institutions, but there's actually different levels of ways that we can trust institutions. And if you could dive down that rabbit hole, I think it'd be really interesting for us.
Well, I think we can think about this more philosophically and start talking about epistemology, or we can talk about it straightforwardly. I think that's the better option.
Yeah.
Yes. So the straightforward option is we're born into a world we don't understand, and over time we have to trust people that tell us what the world is like. Our own personal experience is this very precious small pot of gold compared to all the things we learn from everyone else. So yes, anyone who says they've only learned from their own experience is probably wrong. They've taken shortcuts.
Well, they're also probably doing themselves a disservice.
Correct.
You have all these books on your wall and you're learning from other people's experience. I think that's part of the journey of learning, is knowing when to outsource your knowledge and when to trust your own experience.
Exactly. And once you go down the road of doing that, you have to decide which individuals or institutions are worthy of trust. What does trust mean in this context? Does this mean they will always be your best friend? No, we're talking here about the trust that they will provide accurate information. To think about this, you have to start with the question, well, who would understand this? And you can start doing a particular kind of expert evaluation where you're like, how difficult is this problem? How long would someone have to think to produce effects here? How smart would they have to be? How could they materially support themselves? Incentives, yeah. Do they receive a material or social reward for being correct?
Okay.
If they do, that's very good. That's the sign of a healthy discipline. That's the sign of a healthy field of expertise.
Give me some practical examples here. So let's compare 2-3 different kinds of institutions and then ask those questions, because there's just all these institutions in our lives, from the Food and Drug Administration to the American Heart Association, who are giving us all these information, how to live, how to act. And some of them we can trust, and then some of them we know that a lot of what they're saying isn't true, or is at the very least misleading.
Maybe the best example might be a British tabloid.
Okay.
British tabloids are quite infamous for their sometimes inaccurate reporting. What they're optimizing for is what I guess all newspapers are now optimizing for in the age of internet. It's like eyeballs, it's clicks. What gets the most attention? Is it truth-seeking? No, it's scandal. It's scandal. It's salacious news.
Yellow journalism.
Outlandish stuff. Exactly. And maybe because of the incentives of the internet, all journalism is developing in that direction, where basically their incentive is to get your attention. So while some of them might have admirable professional ethics and still try to report the truth as much as possible, they won't always be rewarded for this. And the people that are the most rewarded, that are the most successful, that get the most attention, are first and foremost optimizing for your attention. So in this sense, yes, you can't trust yellow journalism. If you consume it as entertainment, this is good. If you consume it as like a source of information, then, well, you're confused about what you're buying.
Absolutely.
Now, a better source of information might be a concrete expert. You might imagine someone that's extremely well credentialed in, say, the area of foreign policy, has spent time at like Georgetown, has done work. But then the question is, well, where does this, PhD in foreign relations work? Well, okay, if he works for the State Department, then what's happening is he's giving an official statement by the government. The government will sometimes, of course, say truthfully what it's pursuing in international relations, but the art of diplomacy is the art of omission, right? So you cannot always expect states to be forthcoming about negative aspects of their policy, or even be completely truthful about what motivates policy. If this was not the case, then there would be no such thing as diplomacy. If this person is working for a think tank, it's a very good question. Well, how old is this organization? What is its reputation? Whether it's associations, is it part of a political faction? So when people talk about partisanship, they're not actually going far enough. It's not just like a red tribe and a blue tribe doing Democrat and Republican politics. It's much more complicated than that, where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have a large are large tents. They have many internal factions. Some are driven by, say, ideological sympathies, such as, for example, libertarianism might be. Others are driven by like concrete business interests.
Right.
So to go back to the foreign policy expert that you might trust over the newspaper, figure out what faction they are a part of. They will always have either a professional milieu or some sort of formal affiliation.
Yeah, I think that some of the really dangerous ones are when we think that we're getting information when in fact we're getting marketing or some kind of propaganda. I was at drinks with a buddy on Wednesday night, really smart guy, used to work for one of the big venture capital firms in the Valley. And I was telling him, hey, just read this great blog post about where you used to work, about the future of XY technology. And I thought it was a brilliant post. Sent it to a couple friends. Tell him about the post. He looks me straight in the eye. He goes, yeah, that was just a piece of marketing. That was total content marketing. You got fooled. And I was like, this is exactly the sort of stuff that I should be looking out for. It's things that seem credible, that seem serious, like seem that they have a high signal to noise ratio, when in reality, they're like this distorted truth designed for a specific purpose and an agenda.
Well, to be fair, the best solution to that is to study deeply, right? If you try to like learn through like shallow dives into things, you'll often be very easily led astray. Your registers of the world, your signs of what's happening will be very narrow and easily gamed. You might be like, well, what is the state of relations between these two countries, or what is the situation with this company? Oh, they're issuing very positive statements. Who can issue very positive statements? Anyone under any conditions can issue a very positive statement. It could be completely dishonest in many ways. A better solution might be to reading a lot of newspapers about Syria, or reading a lot of news about a particular branch of the technology industry. Might be reading a book about the fundamentals of, say, the Syrian government, or a book about Assad, or a book about ISIS, or something about, Shia-Sunni conflicts and so on. And in technology, it might be, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to find the best engineer I can and ask them about this concrete technical claim in this press release. Is this claim plausible? And they'll say, yeah, it's trivial. Everyone does this. And they're like, oh my God, okay. What is normal and trivial was misrepresented as amazing. And you know this because you correctly identified an engineer who's perhaps your friend. Maybe there's someone you've hired at your company, someone that has a reason to tell you the truth, but also has a reason to know the truth in the first place. I think there are many honest, very confused people in the world. So I don't always, I don't think I think ignorance is a bigger foe than lies. I'll put it this way.
Yeah, that's very well said. Now, I'm going to ask you a really tricky question. How about things like kayfabe, which are intentionally misleading, but are something else entirely? Give us a background on kayfabe, because it's just ridiculously interesting, but I think that adds a whole other dimension to what you're saying.
Kayfabe is this wonderful concept that's been popularized by Eric Weinstein, who found it from the world of professional wrestling.
Like WWE.
Exactly. In professional wrestling, there would be these like wildly caricaturized fighters who would have a backstory and who would have beefs with each other.
I hate you.
I hate you. You you slept with my ex-wife. You trashed my house at that party. They would like go into these rants and then they would fight. And of course, like we now know, the fight was like predetermined. And they would always in public, whenever microphones were near or fans were near, stick to the story, stick that they have a real beef.
Like full-time actors.
They were full-time actors. Now consider, in an attention economy, a fight is pretty spectacular. It's quite salacious. Hey, what if it's a staged fight? So the idea of kayfabe explains how wrestlers were gathering attention to themselves, benefiting both careers of both actors who had a full-time beef, because it was drama, because it had a human element, and because there was conflict, and people wanted to root for one side or the other. They're like, oh, I like this guy. He's like, wearing the American flag and so on. No, I like that other guy. He, cares about the environment or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. Though this kind of thing translates very, very well to politics, unfortunately, but also to the media landscape. Let's consider. if Nassim Taleb denounces me right now, would this be good for my clicks or bad for my clicks?
Good for your clicks without question. This podcast would go viral.
It will go viral. It will go viral. I mean, a lot of people on the political debate circuit are deeply, deeply cynical about what they do, and they understand when they're debating each other that they're giving each other clicks. Everyone is like, I want to see Ben Shapiro demolished. Can you debate Ben Shapiro? That's amazing. I'll watch you, right? That sort of logic, right? And then on the other end, appearing on, say, a show like, the former show that Jon Stewart started, The Daily Show, I think. Yeah. That often had an element of that, because he would even get people who were not Democrats, who were, say, Republicans. Why did they go on it, right? Even though they knew that might not get the kindest treatment.
So you're saying a lot of these fights are sort of staged,
They're
just
staged.
like WWE, and it's because we live in an attention economy.
We live in an attention economy. We live in a political environment where very well crafted messages are constantly shared with the population. And I think, in a way, the attention economy started 100 years ago, not today. There's this wonderful book by Edward Bernays called Propaganda from 1920. It talks about how in a modern society we will have scientifically managed public opinion, where the tools developed in the 19th century for marketing, Coca-Cola is a 19th century company. You have to remember that. Santa Claus has been, wearing a red suit for 80 years now, right? This is old stuff. What was developed for marketing was translated into politics. For better or worse, right? In the 1930s, certainly we can agree the 1930s was this era of strong propaganda. You had communist propaganda, you had German propaganda, and you had American propaganda. If you don't believe that, maybe watch some Looney Tunes from 1940, right? With contribute to the war effort, all of this. So this attention economy has been with us for a while. It will only get worse in a way. However, it is possible to build institutions that acquire truth even in such an environment.
How do you do that?
I think it would be amazing to recreate real public debates. I think if you could have it be so that people's career and reputation is enhanced by going on stage and having a non-prescripted debate where they discuss their views and defend their views to each other, that will be noteworthy. I think people will be able to smell the difference if only that happens. And if there was such a movement to bring back real public discussion and debate, because the beauty of a real debate is the following. Since views are exposed, yes, rhetorical tricks are used in all of this, but there is something interactive and dynamic. It is the same reason that if you attended a lecture by Feynman versus merely read a physics textbook, you would probably be better you would be better off having attended the lecture and having heard other students ask questions, even if you never ask questions, because you don't always think of which questions to ask. Right. And when you're presenting your position, don't know what you can take for granted. There's an expert's curse here, where an expert doesn't necessarily know what the layman or the non-expert does not know. It can be very hard to remember what you used to be ignorant of. It's much easier to just assume other people are thinking about the same things as you are, right? And this is why it can be so hard to, get experts to talk at an understandable level, almost regardless of discipline.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have a lot of experience on this on your show. So I think that high quality public discussion would represent a training environment where people would once again learn to recognize high quality arguments versus low quality arguments. They would learn to figure out how to poke holes via example, how to actually poke holes in positions rather than have these feigned body slams and, fake chokeholds or whatever. Yeah. If people are doing the equivalent of a fake chokehold when talking to each other, of course they'll be unable to ever converge on a position. We're in a society that is stuck in many shouting sides, but no resolution. And there can be no resolution without actual thought and actual shared thought, because we're a social species. So that would be my best advice, and it seems eminently doable, because the infrastructure overhead of creating a platform with many views is quite low. It's quite easy today to produce something, and this gives you lower operating expenses. So all that has to happen is to have a consumer base that is consciously choosing over and over again substance over form. And then you can have a quite viable attention niche. And this attention won't be stolen because the people understand that, okay, this is what is happening. This is where the action is.
I want to switch gears a bit, and something you just said reminded me of it. But on the trade-offs between stability and dynamism, where most of us think that there's a direct trade-off, but you see the two of them almost working together, because a lot of times in modern society, we condemn tradition. We say that's an old way of doing things, but there is a wisdom of tradition, this intellectual dark matter, so to speak, of why things work, even if we don't understand entirely why they work. But at the same time, dynamism is really important, because right now we have many sclerotic institutions that aren't able to adapt to new ways of doing things, new ways of living, new ways of thinking, new communications technologies. Talk about the trade-off, or the lack thereof, of stability and dynamism.
The normal trade-off is something like conservatism versus innovation. It is something like, do we keep everything the same and keep it nice and safe? Or do we change things with the possibility that everything breaks or that everything goes well? This is a false trade-off to a significant degree, because if you choose to keep everything the same, you are necessarily producing long-term fragility. You are reifying what at once was a live, vibrant, spontaneous adaptation to the circumstances as they were, both social, economic, technological, and you are reifying the form. And you're trying to apply the form in situations where it can't possibly work.
But is there like this natural pace of evolution? Because I could see how somebody could respond to that and say, well, hey, hold on there. The world is now changing faster, and the natural evolution of institutions can't keep up with this increased rate of change.
Well, I think this is where the intentional perspective versus the evolution perspective come to heads. Where my view, this view of focusing on founders, on great founders, tends to view society as a massive deployment of social technologies that were at one point or another engineered by one person or another. We might forget their names, or we might remember their names. It doesn't really matter. Any complex organization often gets off the ground in under 10 years. It's not like this weird process of centuries of corporations having corporation babies and then natural selection culling the corporation babies until the one with the tallest neck wins. It's much more like, okay, this company makes a few mistakes and bam, then it gets it right.
Right, and maybe they have really good recruiting, like a religion or something like that, where things then get off the ground really quickly.
Right, so because I view that as the source of dynamism, I think that an environment where people can build new institutions is more stable in the long run. Because many key services that you rely on, say, an old organization, the old organization will at some point fail and will no longer be able to provide them. If you are in an environment with dynamically new institutions arising all the time, the natural niche that is emptied by this old organization dying is almost immediately filled out by someone new. If you are relying on the power staying on and the power company goes bust, don't you want there to be another power company? You obviously do. One way to think about institutions is they're like a forest. You have this old growth forest with these giant trees. What comes of the forest if there are no saplings? Right? What comes of the forest if all the big trees, are standing tall, but there are no new trees? Well, eventually, lightning, fire, California had experience with fire recently, they destroy the forest. And I think many societies are often like this. If you're relying on the Western Roman state to provide you with security in the 4th century AD, it worked until it didn't.
No, but don't you need some kind of reason for new institutions to be built? Because I'm thinking, isn't the incentive for large institutions to squash, or if it's a large company, to purchase all the small guys to make sure that they never get big? How do you actually build the right incentives in society so that you have this constant regeneration? I see how it could happen in a forest, but in a forest, you don't have quite the same force of tall trees quenching and killing the small saplings.
Well, first off, the tall trees do throw a shade, and shade does get in the way of growth. But in a society, I think what we have to deal with is what I call the succession problem.
Okay.
Where if you imagine that what's happening is deployment of social technologies where companies, organizations are built, these are vast accumulations of resources. Wouldn't it be straightforwardly rational to have these resources be quickly given over to someone that in fact has the ability to extend the life of that company? Wouldn't it be amazing if the CEO after the founder was as unique and as talented and had as much ability to reshape the company as the original founder?
How is Apple doing on the scale? To go back to them.
I think Apple is doing better than many other companies. I think Tim Cook has definitely brought his own stamp to the company. Mm-hmm. I think there are other older companies that obviously, have long ago failed succession. Like no one here expects the Ford to be an innovative car company. No one expects them to make self-driving cars. Of all people, we expect like Elon Musk and Tesla to make self-driving cars. But what happens if Elon Musk was just hired and was given full power within Ford, the same as he had in Tesla? Would he do any worse? I don't think he would. But then the question is, how in the world could we make the institutional incentives work for that? And there are some ways to make it happen. I think that government used to be much more functional in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, because back then you wouldn't go start SpaceX, you would go start NASA. Mm-hmm. The best example of this is, Wernher von Braun, who was a rocket scientist for Germany during World War II and was then brought over to the United States to work for the US Navy, launching basically these rockets, these ICBMs. He had a dream, however. He wanted to help mankind reach the stars. He partners up, of all people, with Walt Disney to produce a documentary called Man in Space, followed by one, Man on the Moon, and the last one, Man on Mars and Beyond.
Three documentaries about going to space. More than a decade before we step foot on the moon.
Over a decade. This is like even before Sputnik as such, even before the Russians launched the first satellite.
So this was his dream in World War II.
Even before World War II, he studied rocketry with the dream of someday developing rocketry to the point of space travel. Let's remember, these are the 1930s, 1920s. Manned flight had barely been achieved. People had barely figured out airplanes, like, Kitty Hawk and, the Wright brothers. Yeah. That was just like 20 years earlier.
December 17th, 1903.
Yeah, exactly. The future seemed infinitely open, and it seemed like travel to other planets might become mundane in just a few decades, just as in 20 years, traveling across the sky became mundane. So going from that, he had been pursuing this dream for a while. He needed funders to, develop rockets. And then, of course, you're German, it's a world war. Well, you work for your government and you build some weapons. That's what you do. This is what Allied scientists also did. There is no Allied scientist during World War II that's not working on weapons in some way or another. The Manhattan Project being like perhaps the best example of this. So he partnered, to go back to von Braun, he partners with Walt Disney. Walt Disney is this amazing figure. We could talk about him for hours. But to talk about this partnership, this video, today we'd call it a video, back then they would call it an episode, a documentary. Eisenhower shows this to his cabinet. President Eisenhower believes the United States has to step its game up in terms of technology. It has to win a technological race, not just an ideological race with the Soviet Union. And his cabinet is highly skeptical. Why would you create something like NASA? Why would you create this agency dedicated to exploring space and going there? What point is there? They're just like rocks or something. Mm-hmm. And then they're shown the very charismatic documentaries where von Braun is clearly displaying his expertise. And then Eisenhower is sort of, well, we're making NASA. Is this a good idea? And people are like, oh yeah, it kind of is a good idea. And we're hiring this guy to do it. And they're like, of course, he's a genius. But before that, they would have been, why are you're hiring some random German scientist?
So how does this lead to Kennedy, who at Rice University in Houston says, we're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Talk about how does that bridge happen from von Braun in the video to Kennedy and then to Neil Armstrong stepping foot on the moon in 1969?
Well, what happens there is NASA is given mandate to officially pursue this goal.
Okay.
Von Braun had lobbied with, moves such as the partnership with Disney, the U.S. government to give him funding and give him mandate for full-on, let's go to the moon, let's go to Mars, let's go even further than that, and drew up these technical plans for this, 1950s technical plans for how would you develop a Mars spaceship if you could, if you were given the money. And he
Computers were the size of buildings at this time.
Of course. This is slide rulers rule the day. There's analog technology. Well, it was enough to create NASA, but it was not enough to give NASA a substantial budget. The Kennedy speech, the Kennedy political moment, helps galvanize and achieve the needed political support to fund this project. NASA has a decade where everyone in the country knows they're doing something prestigious. If you are an engineer, an aerospace engineer, and you say, I'm going to go work at NASA, it sounds wonderful. It sounds sexy. It sounds beautiful. The same way where a few years ago and even now, if someone's like an aerospace engineer and they're like, I'm going to go work for SpaceX, it has a ring to it.
Hell of a recruiting pitch.
It's a recruiting pitch. The government needs help recruiting. I mean, the government can draft you during wartime, but really when you're talking about top talent, you can like put them in a room, but having them work with passion, that's a different matter. So the Kennedy speech helps do that. And the Kennedy speech also helps pass it through the political process of Congress approving the budgets that are large enough.
And all this goes back to Von Braun.
It goes back to Von Braun. And without Von Braun, there would not have been the groundwork laid. The reason why Kennedy could make that speech was because the idea that America could go to space, that maybe the Russians are going to go to space, that going to space might be the next frontier, the next Wild West, that had become a staple of the media landscape.
Wow.
It was good for Disney to talk about this possible amazing future. Disney, by the way, was very much motivated by the idea that American society had lost a frontier and needs to gain a frontier. He talks about this in interviews. He writes about this.
Talk about that.
Well, he tries several approaches. This might sound funny, but when he's building amusement parks and building the areas that are like the Wild West, he's trying to build a simulation. He literally says, I want to bring Americans in touch with their own roots of pioneering. And then when you look at some of the amusement parks where he personally was involved in designing them, it's really clear they're trying to like present a worldview. They're not just entertaining you. They're trying to let you know of, hey, this is what it was like to set up a completely new town. Now, of course, they take some liberties here because he's a salesman, he's an entertainer, but he's selling kind of a real message. And then space and cowboys kind of go together. Today we almost take it for granted. But that was like an interesting thing to do. Like at the time, this was like a rather esoteric thing. Like astronomy was not yet sexy.
Yeah, it's funny because in an age of just media abundance, now that the costs to create media are so low, we forget about media's power to inspire action, whether it be space, whether it be hard work. And I have to wonder if you could make a case for increasing NASA's budget just on the basis that it inspires American citizens and people around the world to work harder, dream bigger, and do more.
You could arguably do that, but I think you would need a charismatic head of NASA. I mean, maybe Elon would want the job. I don't know. Clearly, Elon is in the private sector doing the same job. And what I'm proposing is that, were Von Braun a German immigrant today, and Musk is from South Africa, right? Von Braun would probably try to make a company like SpaceX, and he would try to fundraise that way.
So what you're saying is, in the 1950s, you would go to the U.S. government to make change like this happen, and then you go to the private sector.
Because the U.S. government was flexible enough to recognize new opportunities when presented.
So how did it get so sclerotic? What changed between then and now?
Well, one of the things that changed is like the White House is a much less functional organization than it was back then. It's not literally an empty house, It's not literally waiting for the next president to move in. There's a large bureaucracy. There's a large civil service around the president.
Does that build up automatically through time?
It was built up by many individuals over time. Like the FBI is the brainchild of J. Edgar Hoover, who got to be the director of the FBI for life. And after that, there were no other directors of the FBI that had as long a term or could redefine the agency to be whatever it wanted. In the 1930s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, it was possible to get the people, get the arguments, get some funding, and then approach a key individual in government who would have either a political or a civic interest in working with you. And then you basically got a government t-shirt. You could basically lobby the government into hiring you and your whole team, right? Most of the people that are the initial agents in the FBI are people J. Edgar Hoover had already worked with in the private sector because he came in out of this almost Pinkerton police private investigator world. And there was public demand to do something about organized crime. and he knew how to play that. He came up with the concept of forensics, where it's like, well, why would another police force help? And he could make an argument, well, these local police forces, they do not understand the science of crime solving. With things like fingerprints, hair samples, the FBI will have the best laboratories in the world, and we will make solving crimes a science. And organized crime won't be able to compete with science. It might sound strange that that's the origin of the FBI. It certainly doesn't sound like a high-tech venture now, but that was part of the charm, part of the sales pitch, but also part of the reality. He did bring together experts that had not previously worked on crime that could do things like, fingerprinting, hair analysis, and all of this other stuff that we now, take for granted, that's evolved almost, to the science fiction-like world of CSI, where you can zoom in and enhance, where obviously you can't really zoom into a picture that way.
Is this a natural byproduct of institutions? As you look through history, do you see institutions getting the same bureaucracy and slowness and sclerosis that you see with the American government?
Answer is yes.
Like, should we just take this for granted?
I think it shouldn't be taken for granted because this is the natural course of an institution. It is designed relatively rapidly by a small group of people that know what they're doing. It is designed to solve a particular problem. It becomes a well-functioning machine with inputs. There's money coming in, there's some recruiting pipeline, and there's some outputs, maybe paper reports, maybe solved crimes, maybe rockets going to the moon, maybe rockets falling on London. It really depends on your government's policy. Or the consumer, let's call it the consumer. These are the natural course of an institution, yes, is for it to be sort of abandoned and to fail the succession problem, where the next CEO barely understands how the thing works. And even if they understand how it works, they now have to fight these office politics battles with all the people who do not perceive the new head of the organization, the new leading team, as quite as legitimate.
So there's a huge delta
Yes.
between the first person and the second person
Yes.
that likely isn't as big as the delta between the second person and the third person.
Exactly. That's usually when it fails. Sometimes there are ways to go around this. This is when you have like the equivalent of a handpicked successor, where often you might have someone that's like, a junior partner working with the founder, and then they become the next head of the organization. That works extremely well. There are other things, like I talk about this, there's this history piece titled How Roman Emperors Solved the Succession Problem, where I talk about the Roman Empire had many problems, but the period when they did the best was when the reigning emperor just straightforwardly adopted in a legal sense as a son, the next most powerful general of the country, and they would share governing responsibilities until the emperor retired or died. And that worked very well for about 100 years. So I would say that it is possible with hand-picked succession to actually have organizations that remain flexible and agile for longer. Now, the second thing I would propose is I think many organizations should have sunset clauses. I think the idea of, we are giving NASA a charter for the next 50 years. These are the conditions of the charter. It might be renewed or it might not be, and by default, it's not renewed. Imagine how different such a government would be. It would still be, in a way, a large government. It would still be doing things, but all the bureaucracies in it would be 10, 20 years old, 30 years old. It would be a youthful thing. It would be a young forest with growing trees instead of an old forest with dead trees.
Have you heard of Shirky's law?
No.
It's this idea that institutions will always try to preserve the problem that they're intended to solve.
I think this is true somewhat, but not always, because in particular, I think, whatever we say of NASA, arguably it achieved its mission of going to the moon. And then the problem was, what do we do next? And there was no what do we do next. And Von Braun had retired and the political moment had passed. There was no further political need for the U.S. to continue either funding or promoting NASA as much as it had. And I
would still say NASA must have some of the highest marks in terms of respect for a government institution out of every one.
I think this is true.
I revere NASA.
I think a lot of people revere NASA.
I love NASA.
I think everyone likes it. It's easy to like an agency that's doing cool things in space and like advancing science.
But I think that matters.
So
we shouldn't trivialize that.
I think this is true, but I often think of opportunity cost. I'm like, yes, NASA is great, but it could have been so much better. And if you imagine the world where SpaceX never arose, that's a world where NASA's technical capacities sort of stagnate, right? At least in terms of launch vehicles. And that's rather unfortunate. And to be to go, back to your question had been on, should we be used to this? I think the answer is no. I think what we should in fact try to do is we should figure out how it is possible for a talented team to approach the government and to make the PR lineup with the local political needs to build new parts of government that are agile, independent, unencumbered. And to say, your second question, the question about preserving problems, I think preserving problems is often, it's often a case where the initial founders are creating the things for a reason. They want a problem solved. They personally want a problem solved.
But by definition, if an institution exists forever and a problem has an end date, you have this misalignment of incentives.
Of course, but I'm saying that, bureaucracies can be highly functional when they're founded. The idea that bureaucracies are necessarily dysfunctional is funny. It's funny because whatever we think about, say, U.S. government in the 1940s, the Manhattan Project, an impressive effort, an efficient effort. Whatever we think about it, many thousands of people land on Normandy. That's a feat of coordination. That's a feat of logistical capacity.
Right.
Clearly, bureaucracies can be functional, especially because Amazon right now is a functional bureaucry.
Yeah, totally.
The roles have
almost
been
too functional.
Perhaps too functional, but I'm going to say it's too functional only when I feel like not using Amazon same day delivery. Yeah. I think it's beautiful. I think it's wonderful. But I think that if you imagine a world where no one within Amazon has the power to override those local incentives towards preserving your own job at all costs, then that system would become just as sclerotic as a government agency. And in fact, the Amazon of 50 years from now might end up looking like that. We might have to prepare for the world where Amazon is like the DMV. Imagine an Amazon that ate a large chunk of the economy, and then, Bezos is no longer around, and you have to stand in line to get your Amazon Prime subscription, and the customer service is bad.
Okay. I got a question for you. So I'm going to throw death into the equation here, which is a fun place to go because you are giving me millions and millions of ideas. And death is the most interesting one right now. What is the role of death and institutions? And I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first one is Kennedy dying after he makes the proclamation that we're going to go to the moon. Kennedy dies, and I wonder if because he died, the chances of us going to the moon went up. The other one would be Steve Jobs, where Steve Jobs dies, and Apple's brand value from that definitely went up after he died because he became this iconic figure, and a lot of the negatives were sort of stripped away from the story. And then a pseudonymous example, which is Satoshi with Bitcoin. You talk to Bitcoin activists, Bitcoin maximalists, and they are some of the most fervent, passionate people I have met in my entire life. What is the role of Satoshi, Steve Jobs, and John F. Kennedy with an institution in terms of preserving it and giving it that energy?
That's a very interesting question, very provocative question. I'm going to say that heroes start as leaders and end up myths. I think a legitimizing myth, the myth of the perfect person that did no wrong, that can be very powerful for an organization. The person, the human, becomes the icon. I think myths are important. We should have myths. But I also believe that leadership is very important. So if by the death of a leader, there is no leader, there is just a myth, that myth will not last very long because the organization that remains, the institution that remains, will tarnish the name of the myth. Imagine a world where people still think fondly of Steve Jobs, but where Apple products are no longer bought, right? That is an interesting world. I think that with Kennedy in particular, well, he was a person of great passions and great talents, and he clearly also made some missteps during his administration, which we tend to not think about. We don't think about, the Cuban Missile Crisis was actually avoidable. It was actually very risky. So I think, yes, maybe in a way, his political capital was at an all-time high. He put his political capital into, going to the moon. And had he continued to spend his political capital in other ways, had he started accumulating failures instead of kind of being cut off at his prime, that investment would be worth much less. NASA couldn't be like, this was Kennedy's dream. It would be like, oh yeah, that's Kennedy's dream. That's like if you try to say right now, well, Trump's dream or even Obama's dream or Bush's dream, it's just, yeah, the realities of politics, there tends to get mud on your name. You tend to get both wins and losses. And then I don't know, I'm not qualified to speculate whether Kennedy would have become an even, more influential American president. It's quite possible he wouldn't have. I'm going to say, though, had he excelled at leadership, the legend would have been even greater.
I want to do a quick geopolitical fire round because we have so many things to talk about. So I'm just going to throw some ideas at you. And if you can just give me responses, 2 minutes or less, let's do it. So one of the things that I think is really interesting, one of your most interesting ideas is that who controls Eurasia controls the world. Talk about America's incentive to have some tension in Europe.
Well, I have to first credit this idea to like a classics in geopolitics, that's Mackinder's heartland theory. The United States has, after World War II, enjoyed being the world's largest economy behind an impassable barrier of 2 giant oceans. To have the raw resources necessary to maintain a big navy, a navy that is as large as the US Navy, to control these oceans, you would need an economy that's at least as large as that of the United States. China right now relies very profoundly on resources flowing in from the Middle East, from Russia, from like Western Europe, sending goods back, such as like things like machine tools from Germany. Basically, if you could politically unify in, say, a trade bloc, a large chunk of Eurasia, say a chunk of the Middle East or Russia, with an industrial giant like China, resource flows could not be interrupted by a naval blockade. As long as resource flows can be interrupted by a naval blockade, it is possible to use your navy to stop another country using its factories to produce a bigger navy than you have. This is the story of World War I. Germany and Britain. Britain effectively starves out Germany. Germans are suffering from food shortages at the end of World War I because they don't have enough food to feed themselves. They're an industrial country. They import their food. China imports oil. Today, oil is in a way food. Oil is used to produce fertilizers, are used to grow food. Right? An oil blockade of a country is absolutely crushing. So I don't think China or the United States are anywhere near a war. But whenever you make a strategic decision, you have to realize that if I escalate this too much, I'm going to lose. So you don't escalate it. So even like things that are much lower stakes than a full-out war get resolved in your favor because you have this dominance.
So back to Eurasia with that key piece of
Eurasia
the global
is
map.
large enough to provide all the resources a modern industrial economy would need. If you had a Eurasian power, they could trade for some things with, say, South America or Africa or Australia or North America, but they don't need anything. It is, in fact, we live in a highly interdependent industrial economy. This highly interdependent industrial economy requires many resources. These resources are found all over the world. And basically, if you could get all industrial resources that you need, and then you no longer need to trade with someone, then you have the ability to maintain your industry even in a situation of wartime. And again, World War II, clear demonstration, Germans suffer from not having enough oil. Towards the end of the war, they have to resort to like exotic options like transmuting coal into liquefying coal. Yes, it's a really ineffective process, but it was their only way to get fuel in 1944.
Another functional institution, the Germans during World War II. Not in good ways, but I think it would definitely be interesting to study.
Oh, I think it's definitely worth, and some people spend a lifetime studying these things. But this is what I have to say about the heartland theory. It also has other elements, such as if you imagine trying to fight a land war, where instead of going and fighting the Russians, you have to first fight Ukrainians, or you have to fight the Russians in Poland, or you have to fight them in Germany. Each additional country you add to the list is a strictly worse strategic position. You might not have the military advantage to be able to invade a Eurasian superpower. A Eurasian superpower, just nowhere in the world could you gather enough resources to do that.
Culture's got to be an issue too.
Of course.
In Europe, if you're trying to take over Eurasia, you're going to have to deal with so many different languages, and you probably, I would assume, have the highest density of different languages, maybe India, but Eurasia has a very high density of different languages, at least compared to a place like America.
I think what's also, one of the big advantages is, yes, there's a cultural patrimony, there's a little bit of a fragmentation, but, it's precisely this fragmentation that makes the project of, say, unifying a Eurasian state so difficult, and why everyone, from Napoleon to Genghis Khan has attempted it, but kind of failed. But, in history, efforts fail until they succeed, right? There is a trend historically towards larger states or even trans-state entities. I think the current solution we have for this is the idea that the whole world comes to integrate through international institutions, and then integration energy flows into those rather than into more regional alliances, on the theory that this, promotes world peace. This is explicitly thought out in the Charter of the League of Nations, and also it's like implicit in a lot of the United Nations documents and so on.
So back to the fire round, the sovereign individual thesis versus the large nation states that you just mentioned.
I'm on the side of the nation states. I think the economies, in terms of what's going to happen, let's leave personal sympathies aside. I think that we are living in a society where mass surveillance has become more economical, not less economical. It is possible for a state to figure out that you are using Bitcoin. If a state wanted to outlaw Bitcoin, a state can just lock you up for, you have used Bitcoin. That is illegal, bro. Right? The most natural comparison here might be like illegal digital content, right? We have, the child pornography, for example. It's possible to track those people down. And if it's possible to track those people down, it'll be possible to track down many individuals who might try to use such things. And this is because fundamentally our computers are not secure, right? Computers have built-in backdoors from day one.
Tons of security holes.
Yes. And some of them are intentionally built, and some of them are just omission, where we have not engineered engineering culture has not reached a high enough level of safety there. So the idea that we can technologically harden the individual against state control is unlikely, because the production of technology is highly centralized. So it is always possible for a government to approach a company that's manufacturing computers and say, you will build in this backdoor and you will not tell anyone you've built in this backdoor.
But then to take the opposite perspective,
Sure.
haven't computers and computing technology made it way easier to be less dependent on geography? Sure, we're seeing a move where people need to be in places like San Francisco and New York to do work, and actually face-to-face interaction is really important. But still, if you have an online business, you can move around and be much more mobile due to computing technology, and I see those trends accelerating. So I think that would be a point for the sovereign individual thesis. Yes,
I think in order for that to be important, the sovereign individual has to have somewhere to go. Where if there are large chunks of the world that are basically run the same way, the delta, the amount of freedom you buy this way, is relatively low. I do think that there is a thing, but I think there's a reality there, but only a very small number of people. There are millions and millions of people changing countries because of political conditions, economic conditions today, but it's only still a very small fraction of the population
but don't
doing
you think
that.
That there's a growing incentive for states to increase that delta?
I think that some states will be very good at basically brain drain. They'll be very good at catering to highly economically valuable individuals. However, I think the number of such individuals is fairly small. So I think you might see in the future a city like Singapore outperform the United States on attracting the world's top talent. A small state, if it has a critical mass of interesting people and if it has a very favorable policy, could make the argument of, the future of technology is going to be built here rather than in the United States, right? And Silicon Valley, in fact, has problems with local government in California. For all its media power and wealth, it can't get San Francisco to build more houses. And it's kind of interesting, right? It certainly would be in the best interest of all these companies for that to happen, yet they can't make it happen. And I think that's a good reality check on the power of tech companies. But that's a whole separate topic. I still think that some individuals, yes, will be empowered by technology. I think for most of us, though, the transition to trek to another continent or to go to a different country will remain a difficult proposition. And because of that, our lives will still be relatively prescribed by the societies where we tend to find ourselves in.
Interesting, because I think one thing that supports what you're saying is the rise of nationalism. I was in Spain earlier this year, and I spent an entire day with a staunch Basque nationalist. Basque country is in northern Spain, and they have a pretty insular culture that they're very proud of, their own language. And it's actually one of the oldest languages in the world, and we have no idea where a lot of Basque culture and the language comes from. Interestingly, I loved the guy. I thought he was great. And he was the first person to give me really good arguments for why nationalism and geography and place and things like family are undervalued by a lot of intellectuals.
I think this is true. I think partially the normal career track of an intellectual is to like try to find the most interesting people in the world and talk to them. And that's like necessarily cosmopolitan. I don't think that has changed too much. Like, you know, if you look in the 12th century, you would have in medieval times, people go from like Paris to Oxford to Rome. It would just like these people would travel. On the thing is, for most people, however, the country where they find themselves is probably going to be the country where they die. They're going to spend their life. Now, the extent to which I would tie nationalism to smaller communities is an interesting question. I think that, you know, that you have local community in a village, this can happen within the context of a multi-ethnic state, or it can fail to happen in the context of a nationalist state, right? Just because you're like, oh, we now created, you know, a state for Basques doesn't mean you know your neighbor. You might know your neighbor or you might not. It depends on how atomized the society is. This is, you know, a concept that goes back to sort of the beginnings of sociology in the 19th century, where people noticed that because of industrialization, people left their villages and went to the cities. Now, in the cities in the 19th century, people probably spoke the same language you spoke in the village, but social fabric, family, community had been undermined just as well.
So back to the fire round. Lee Kuan Yew and what he's been able to do with Singapore. You just mentioned Singapore. We've talked a bit about Asia. Lee Kuan Yew is fascinating.
Lee Kuan Yew has to be credited with the only country that has successfully transitioned from the third world to the first. Arguably, you could argue China has made that transition, but China was a communist country. That's the second world. So Singapore is a former colonial country that starts in 1950 with a GDP per capita that is the same as that of Jamaica. Now today, obviously, in many ways, Singapore is a better place to live, or at least a wealthier place to live than many first world countries. Absolutely. So in terms of former colonies, it's done remarkable. I think what Lee Kuan Yew does quite embody this kind of like archetype of the great founder. You cannot make the argument that his personality and views did not impact the economic and political institutions of Singapore. Does this mean he personally built all of Singapore's companies? No, it definitely doesn't mean that. It does mean he built out the city government that provided a coherent business policy for why you should invest in Singapore. It also means he built out a firm political structure that was not prone to upheavals. In the immediate aftermath of independence, there was a struggle with the local communists. Had local communists, which had some amount of international support, won, Singapore might still eventually have become a developed country, but it would have been a much longer route. It would have been a route more similar to the one China is taking. And it's not clear it would have gone anywhere. It would not have been a very valuable port city, all things considered. Leveraging international markets and the Western community, the Western political community, gave them a huge premium, right? Most trade that was going in Southeast Asia during that time was going through the Western economic system. It wasn't going through this weird system of pseudo-international trade that the socialist countries had with each other. So I feel that also he had the vision to understand which institutions can be transplanted and can be kept from the old British Empire, and which ones have to be replaced.
Give some examples of that.
Common law. He was educated as a lawyer, and he understood that you need a highly talented pool of people that are practicing common law, and that if you have such an environment, first off, the legal system will be fairly above board, and it will be possible to have a business environment where things occur in a predictable way. But also, when people come from the United States or from Europe, they'll have a familiar environment to work in. The legal environment won't be exotic. It won't be strange. They won't fear that, oh, maybe if I invest here, my company is going to be nationalized. I'm going to lose my company a few years later. And that was very important. Another thing that was important was he kept the civil service bureaucracy that had been built by the British And these were like highly functional local bureaucracies, except now he aligned it with the interests of the Singaporean government rather than it being aligned with the interests of London. And there's another nice example here. Hong Kong had fully under British administration, developed quite well, and had two similar advantages. Again, English common law and basically a good civil service that was not corrupt, that was carrying out tasks efficiently, and was responsive to new policies set by the government.
The Suez Canal as a geopolitical bottleneck, and give us the before the Suez Canal and the after of the Suez Canal.
Well, this at this point is very old history, but history is always relevant because it's not over yet.
Remind us where it is.
The Suez Canal is in Egypt today. It connects the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So it connects the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea, past Saudi Arabia, to the Mediterranean. The British Empire had acquired India. And in order to reach India, you had to sail all the way south past South Africa, past the Cape of Good Hope to reach India. Opening the Suez Canal shortened that route notably. This immediately made the Suez Canal immensely profitable because every ship that would take this shortcut, be it a British ship or not a British ship, would have to pay a fee. It was called Suez Gold. And Suez was important enough that one of the objectives Germans had during World War II was trying to seize the Suez Canal. Because what this also does, it has a military function. You can move your navy fluidly from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. If a hostile land power takes over the Suez Canal and prevents you from using it, then your ships in the Mediterranean can't regroup with your ships in the Indian Ocean without sailing all the way into the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
You can find, if you look at modern Russia has to maintain 5 navies. It has one in the Caspian Sea in the middle of Eurasia. It has one in the Black Sea. It has one in the Baltic Sea. It has one in the Arctic Sea. Even if all of these navies together were as big as, say, the U.S. Navy, they still could not defeat the U.S. Navy because the U.S. Navy could pick them off one by one. And this was the reality of navies for many, many centuries before today, and it still applies today. So Suez Canal allows Britain lower overhead for moving naval forces around the Middle East. It enables them to dominate the Middle East. It reduces overhead for reaching India. So, communications to India are expedited. And it allowed it to take a cut from all global trade that used this more efficient route.
Does Britain still control the Suez Canal?
No. 60 years ago, there was the so-called Suez Crisis, which was a brief war that sort of marks the end of the British Empire, where Britain and France tried to seize the Suez Canal by force from an Egyptian government. Egypt had become independent, that had nationalized it. Egypt sort of moved in and said, okay, this is now ours. And their argument was, well, you're profiting off of our geography. We will be able to run the canal itself and we'll use the money from it to develop and so on. And Britain wasn't up for this. However, due to the Cold War situation, where the United States in particular did not want to appear like it was supporting colonialism because it was trying to acquire Middle Eastern allies, Arab allies, it vetoed this action. So Britain and France kind of had to, in shame, let go of this military intervention. And that was a crucial story of decolonialization. The Panama Canal, similarly, for a long time.
Same with the navies. It connected.
Exactly.
The American Navy turned it into one unit. Yes.
Yes. You could have a single navy for the Atlantic and the Pacific, and also it shortened travel. Can you imagine? If you want
to go all the way down below South America.
Before the Transcontinental Railroad and before the Panama Canal, you would have to sail all the way past Argentina if you want to go from New York to San Francisco. Can you imagine that? And then rail solves personal transportation, but it's vastly more economical to ship goods via ship than via rail, even today. All those wonderful container ships.
If it floats, it's cheap.
Exactly. Even today, if you look at, you can have a wonderful view of container ships sailing past Golden Gate Bridge and Alcatraz. Some things never change, right? And a lot of those containers come from China or come from Europe and so on.
Phenomenal answer. That was just so much knowledge packed into there. Thank you. Intellectual dark matter. One of my favorite terms is legibility, and which is just this idea that I'll let you run with it. One of my favorite terms is legibility, and you have a term called intellectual dark matter. Yes. Run with that.
Intellectual dark matter. Well, physicists have a term, dark matter. It turns out most of the mass in the universe, most of the matter in the universe is invisible. We can't see it. If we point our telescopes, try to detect it, it's not there. So how do we know that there's more mass, or why do physicists posit? Yes, exactly. The visible galaxies spin at a certain rate. And were their mass notably lower, they would spin apart, they would fly apart. Because they're not flying apart, we know there's some missing mass. Something is there, something is, exerting a gravitational pull. Now, there are many different physical theories of physics for what exactly is happening there, but I feel that the same applies to the intellectual world. The same applies to when you read a scientific paper. There is the invisible tacit knowledge of the practical know-how of how to run the experiment described in the paper. Whenever you try to actually replicate an experiment, it's not enough to read the paper. You have to go talk to the lab team that ran the original experiment, and you have to work with them until you get the conditions just right.
I'm sort of thinking of abstractions here, that as you go up one level of abstraction, you're losing a lot of information that's really important.
But this is the information that's, to use the term legibility, that's legible, right? The academic paper is legible. The laboratory know-how is not legible. It's not known at a glance. It can't be conveyed in a few simple words. It can't be conveyed in a paper abstract. Our society has other kinds of intellectual dark matter as well, where many of our current thoughts are built out by people that had profoundly been influenced by philosophers that are long gone. You might consider the Constitution of the United States as partially a product of this long extended study in political philosophy, where, Benjamin Franklin and, Alexander Hamilton and so on, they are reading Greek philosophers. So today, when you look at the United States, you might not see, well, this is a product of Greek philosophy, but in a way, a lot of it is the missing mass holding the whole contraption together. And there are many, many other examples. Like my favorite example here is Henry Bessemer, who introduced the Bessemer process at the start of the 20th century. It is a notably better way to make steel. So he does the straightforward thing. He's figured out a better way to make steel. He applies for a patent with the U.S. Patent Office. They grant him a patent. A bunch of steel mills try to use his process. They're like, this isn't working. He corresponds with them. It's still not working. It reaches the point where they're accusing him of fraud, where they're saying, your patent doesn't really work. And Henry Bessemer is like, well, I'm done with this. I'm actually going to go and make my own steel mill. And he does. He makes, he creates a company, sets up a steel mill, and the process works. In other words, he had the tacit knowledge to make the process work. It was not possible to communicate it in writing. It was not possible to specify the formal, visible patent. Note, patents are literally descriptions of technology that are legible enough that bureaucracies and governments can comprehend them.
Right.
Yeah, and it was insufficient to make better steel, this very concrete, very physical thing. This is like not an abstract point of code. This is like, how do you build this material? How do you make this material? Anyway, once that steel mill was up and running, well, first off, it was super profitable. Secondly, when people had the experience of working in that steel mill, then it was much easier to set up other steel mills running with the same process, even if they weren't owned by the same company.
How could we teach tacit knowledge? I feel like video has to be an emerging technology which could teach tacit knowledge fairly well, because that seems like one bottleneck in terms of the way that knowledge is transferred. That seems like a big bottleneck on society.
It is a big bottleneck. I think YouTube, in fact, has rendered a bunch of knowledge visible that was previously invisible.
There's a great story of Jason Tatum on the Boston Celtics.
Right.
And he's 21, 22 years old and has great footwork, famous for his great footwork, and is one of the great up-and-coming NBA players right now. Recent Wall Street Journal article, he was asked, how have you learned at such a young age how to have such good footwork? He's at 22 years old, has the footwork of someone who's been in the league for a decade. And what you're seeing more and more is this YouTube generation of athletes from golf, with these young stars have incredible golf swings. In basketball, great footwork, great shooting technique, and just like what you're saying, video and YouTube is able to transmit tacit knowledge in a way that text just isn't.
Well, text never could, especially not for something like football or basketball, but coaches could to a certain extent, because they had seen other good players and they could correct new players one step at a time. But we are never quite good with we're not very good at describing the movements of our bodies in words, in text. There's a gap between the tactile and the verbal. And I think that when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to setting up equipment, there is a tactile component. We forget that despite all our advancements, we're still these bodies, these mammals, these human beings lumbering one piece of machinery, dragging it with our hands to the next piece of machinery. That is still an unskippable step. We are not yet quite as automated as many people think. Let's remember, a lot of the reason there was the rise of China was not powered by robots, it was powered by cheap labor. That should in itself point to how vital human steps still are in the production process. And when you go to the higher skill end, such as something like basketball, or something like how do you manufacture precision machine tools? Machine tools are the tools that we use to build the normal factory equipment that a factory might use to make something like a car or whatever. That equipment has to be built by someone, has to be built by machines that are engineered to a high precision. There are only a few factories in the world that know how to make actually good machine tools. And there are many examples of companies trying, much as happened with the Bessemer process, trying but failing to make good enough machine tools.
One thing that I've really gotten from you is mathematicians do this really well. They're able to transmit knowledge through their cultures of apprenticeship that alleviate these problems that we're seeing in other parts of society.
Of course. And, mathematics might not feel as tactile as, say, basketball, but in a way, a lot of it is nonverbal. It has a mathematician going, and looking at something. And the real work's happening in his head. It's not happening with the equations he might be writing down. Those are a tool, a way to communicate. Process. It's a highly specialized language. Yes. And what happens is it's a pretty strong effect when you look at the 19th and the 20th century. The mathematicians that have worked with the very best mathematicians are disproportionately likely to be very good mathematicians themselves. Now, maybe there's a story by which the smartest people always get together, but you have to ask yourself, really? Is that really that efficient? I think it's a much more straightforward explanation that there is a premium having worked with and seen the problem-solving intuitions of another human being that is highly skilled over and over and over and over again. And this is why, you have every single one of Gauss's students. Now, Gauss is this famous 19th century mathematician. Many of them were great mathematicians themselves. He almost single-handedly spawns a whole new generation. And even today, if you're lucky enough to work with a Fields medalist, you are disproportionately likely to do very well yourself in mathematics as well.
Really interesting. This seems like a massive opportunity filled with latent potential for human growth and the acceleration of learning.
This is what real education looks like. Real education should be about the production of excellence and learning from the very best and making more of the very best.
So I'm going to ask you, how do you consume information? Because one thing that we're seeing is, especially in geopolitics, probably as much as any other discipline, these trade-offs between looking at the big picture macro view from a bird's eye view and then getting this worms-like view of actually spending time in places like America, Slovenia. How do you consume information? How do you learn and think about geopolitics?
Well, I generally think about institutions overall, and the recipe is quite similar. Is it geopolitics, or it might be a large company, or it might be a city government? There is the process of understanding the paper trail. You have to understand how the large bureaucracies are thinking. So you go read their documentation where they describe their processes. You analyze the process. You then go read their official statements, their PR statements, and you understand, well, what is the policy that is being pursued here, or what is the outcome if there is no intentional policy? Then you start mapping out concrete individuals. If you can, you should meet these individuals. This is where the tactile component comes in.
So this seems like a big thing that you really try to do is have conversations with people in power, high-level individuals, so that you can get the tactile. Like when I study you, what I've gathered from you is that seems to be the big delta between you and most people.
I think this is definitely one of the large chunks of it. I think the other chunk is there's a technical art to understanding how the machines work, the bureaucracies work. And when you put together the machine of the bureaucracy plus the information and assessment of the individual together, you get an almost complete picture of what will happen either politically or economically. And you can answer these relatively bounded questions with an intensive where you go study the organization for 3 to 6 months, or you go investigate a city in a particular city government or something like this. And yeah, I think that too few people have the affordance to go and talk to a VIP. One of my most basic insights has been that it's not difficult to talk to an important person. What's difficult is having something worth saying. And because people know on an intuitive level, oh, I don't have anything worth saying, they won't put in the effort to spend 3 or 4 months figuring out how to talk to someone. There's also a self-catalyzing process via things like referrals and so on, where after you've talked to a few people, it becomes notably easier to talk to more people. The interesting people of the world don't always work together, but they tend to know each other.
That's very well put. I wish I could say some of the people that you've worked with, because they are household names that are ridiculously cool. I want to double click on what you said about those conversations. How do you learn from somebody in conversation? Because you know, on these podcasts, people always ask, what's a book recommendation or whatever? And I think that we've actually almost hit the limits of book recommendations. That's a very legible thing that I think that knowledge has been diffused through society quite well. But in terms of learning through conversation, that is systematically underrated, undervalued, and understudied.
I'm going to say that people actually do think differently. So when you are talking to someone, discover and try to find the generators of their thoughts. If they're surprising you over and over again with insight, try to figure out, is this insight the product of a standardized education, or is the product of a particular view that they themselves develop? If it is a view that they themselves develop, try to yourself to guess what it is. Try to state like a simple rule or a generator. Try to notice what the person is doing over and over and over again, and you'll figure out it's probably something you're not doing yourself. It's probably possibly something no one else in the world is doing. And these kinds of like implicit observations, when you have the opportunity to talk to someone for 5 or 10 hours, are invaluable. Often you can learn how to do the same thing yourself. You're never going to quite live the same life someone has lived, but you can learn to think like they do in a small way. Also, you know, as a separate thing, people will have special pieces of information. They're going to have special information about the world. You should reason out, just as with institutions when we discussed institutional epistemology, what kind of special information, A, the person has. So are they likely to have figured out something? B, are incentivized to share with you. Because I do consulting work, often the incentives align very well for the sharing of information, right? But if you were to approach the exact same person as, you know, a reporter, a journalist, you might have a harder time getting the information out of them if it represents a comparative advantage, right, that they don't want to give up. Proprietary information is definitely one of the things that surrounds us in this society. Absolutely. People need to support themselves.
So you're now talking about meeting with people in high levels of society, the highest levels of society. Go back to where you were 10 years ago, somebody who didn't have a lot of those privileges, who was just beginning and had this ferocious curiosity for studying these things. What would you say to yourself then in terms of learning through conversation and meeting people who had some of that knowledge that they could give you? How did you train yourself?
Well, you know, I started off being like quite idealistic about physics. I wanted to be a scientist. When I sort of like came to be somewhat disillusioned with the state of academia, I dropped out, and I ended up spending a lot of my time. You know, first off, I decided that I am going to try to understand society. I'm going to try to understand why social phenomena come about, and because I had already discounted academia for physics, it would seem unwise to go and say be a sociologist in academia or an economist in academia, you know, though there are many economists that do excellent work. Self-funding through basically software jobs, followed with many-month research intensives at the university and research libraries across Europe. One of the advantages I found myself having was travel is easy in Europe. It's not expensive, especially if you technically had student status or could claim something else, to hop on a train and go spend 2 weeks in Vienna or 2 weeks in Berlin or 2 weeks in Rome or 2 weeks in Paris or a month in London, especially because one of the advantages I could pull upon, I didn't come from like a privileged background, being interesting on the internet is a way to make friends.
Amen.
And you talk to your friends via Skype, and then you talked after a while, you're like, hey, could I come stay with you for a week? We could talk about this stuff. And not only would I then talk to like a very interesting person and sleep on their couch for a week, I could like go visit the relevant research library and like go study to my heart's contentment, all of this interesting stuff about institutions and history and so on. And the experience of going to multiple cities and contrasting how different culture can be, how different city governments can be, that really puts in this tacit perspective that you are coming in not just with a Silicon Valley perspective, but you're maybe coming in with a London perspective or a Berlin perspective or a Chinese perspective. I'll be visiting China this March for the first time. I'm looking forward to learning a lot because I know that with all the study, with all the people you might talk to, visiting a place, seeing how it's run with your own eyes will always be different from the PR statements, from the narrative that others might even craft about them, or from what's apparent from the paper trail. So what I would tell myself is, you should tour more factories. This is something I only did in my late 20s, but it really brought appreciation for the industrial.
Make that happen?
Oh, it's really easy. You just make friends with relevant engineers and they will literally show you where they work, and they're going to tell you everything they know sort of about the office politics of their environment and their process. They're going to be proud about it.
So that is a really interesting heuristic. When you're traveling, when you get in a place, how can you help me travel better, help us travel better in terms of heuristics to think through that most of us aren't doing when we travel so that we can grab this tacit knowledge?
Okay. Make friends that are either working in a field you want to study, meet them online, talk to them over Skype, and then go visit them. If they already know you, you're coming to a place like Shenzhen and you have 10 people that already know you. This is a radically different experience. I'll routinely go to a city and have 9 meetings scheduled per day. You might think I might burn out, but one of these meetings is a breakfast with someone I've been corresponding with for years. The dinner might be with someone who I've had an amazing Skype conversation about, industrial design. And lunch might be with someone else. And then, of course, the 9th person I'm staying with, well, I'm just staying on their couch. Now, more recently, I've done less couch surfing and much more hotels and Airbnbs, but I can't recommend couch surfing enough, especially in early and mid-20s, because, once you're in someone's home, they often get quite real. Like one of the better decisions I did make when I was young was making friends with professors, going over for dinner, going for drinks. I learned so much more about these disciplines than I ever could through these informal interactions and this personal human connection and studying the people. Because, it is said that people are, reflections of their society. This means you can study society by the people, right? If people are somewhat produced by their environment, you can learn many, many things just by talking to a person and seeing who they are.
Well, Samo, thank you for an amazing conversation. You are a wealth of knowledge, and this was a blast.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Hey again, David here one more time. If you love to learn, you can sign up for my weekly newsletter, The Monday Musings, where I share the coolest things I learn every single week, along with links to new articles and podcasts. You'll find a link in the show notes. At my company, North Star Media, we help companies and individuals build their brands. If you or anybody that you know wants to start sharing their ideas, growing their audience, or building a brand for themselves, reach out to me directly. North Star Media specializes in blog posts, videos, and podcasts just like this one. You can support the North Star podcast by leaving a review on iTunes. It helps people find the show. And if you enjoyed this episode, you'll also like the episode with Kevin Kwok. In that episode, Kevin and I jump between various topics, such as A/B testing cities in China, Saudi Arabia, the future of democracy, and why we have democracies in countries but dictators in companies. Thank you so much for listening.